Hello and welcome back to the channel. So today I'll be talking about a potential 9-game SEC schedule. All over this past summer, there's been a lot of talk amongst the SEC media days, among the teams, among the fans, of if the SEC should move to 9-game schedule. The Big Ten did it, and there's a lot of pressure of like, hey, you're not being fair. You're only playing 8 games. You play more conference games. And I think that we should, but I've found out a way that there you can still keep a lot of the storied programs, a lot of the storied rivalries, playing each other, and at the same exact time playing every single SEC team over the next 2 years. Because I think that's a huge thing that we're missing this upcoming schedule is that we're just playing the same exact opponents we played last year, and so it takes away a lot of the good games you could possibly see. So with this move to 16 teams, obviously I think that as a team, you can have 3 consistent opponents. So I'll talk about that in each time that I talk about each team, and then a rotating door of 6 opponents. So that gets you all 16 teams, and that gets you to be able to play, over the next 4 years if we continue on to that path of being able to play in other people's places and them coming to yours. So I think that's one of the things I'll mainly just talk about if a 2-year plan were to put it into place because at the very end of the video, and the reason why it took me a little while to make this video, if Clemson and Florida State rumors are kind of true, and over the next 2 years, that Clemson and Florida State decided to join the SEC to make it an 18-game schedule, I made a little tweak and I had to try to figure out how I can make it work so that you can still keep all the storied rivalries together while also being able to play every single team. It's a little bit different, but I'll discuss that at the very end of the video. So, starting off in alphabetical order, we have Alabama. Now, Alabama, there are 3 consistent opponents. Now, obviously, you got to keep the 2 big ones. That's going to be Auburn, the Iron Bowl, and then also against Tennessee, third Saturday in October. Now, Alabama fans, you can sound off in the comments below. I understand. Like I said, there's going to be some rivalries that are going to be cut. And in this one in particular is the Saban Bowl against LSU. Now, why did I cut the Saban Bowl? I'll talk about it a little bit more also with the LSU team, but in my mind, the LSU versus Alabama wasn't as big as it was until Saban got to both teams. And now that Saban's gone, is it going to have the same exact impact? I think that obviously they're still good teams, so they'll be playing against each other. It's going to be like hard fought battles, but is it going to have the same kind of anger that it had before? I don't know. So, in order to kind of lead LSU to play more Western teams that, especially they have played in the past, and also do a lot of recruiting battles against, I decided to go away from them playing Alabama. Instead, Alabama plays Mississippi State. It's still a big rivalry for the region. Obviously, like the overall SEC doesn't see it as a big rivalry, but it still is a big rivalry for that region for Tuscaloosa to Starkville, very close together. Some people call it the Battle of the Jacksons. I think it's like I'm trying to think of the actual highway that goes through, but it's still a relatively big schedule, and also kind of gives Alabama where they don't have to play 3 premier teams. Hopefully, Auburn gets back to being a premier team in the SEC. Haven't been for a while. So, but those are your 3 consistent opponents. So, based off of this upcoming schedule in 2025, I kind of base that off of who you're playing, away or home for your constant opponents, and also for 2027 because, like I said, the people you're playing in 2025, I'll carry that over into 2027. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But starting with 2026, your rotational teams you're going to be going against is you're going to be going to Texas A&M, you're going to be going to Ole Miss, to Arkansas, and obviously you'll be going to Tennessee. Now, like I said, it's a little bit of a tough road schedule, but it's not going to be overly hard for Alabama. But you still have some tough opponents because you have to play against Texas, against Florida, and like I said, obviously you have Kentucky and Auburn and Mississippi State. So it's still a tough enough schedule, but it's not like unbearably hard. And I'm going to make sure that make that note right here. Every single schedule, I try to make sure that if I place a team against another team, that I'm not trying to absolutely destroy their season, because I want to make sure they're still like, okay, well, we got good home games, we got good away games. Obviously, like, if you don't like the way that I made the schedule, you can let me know in the comments below. I love to hear your comments. but I try to make it as fair as possible. Going into 2027 for Alabama, obviously you'll be switching. So those constant opponents, you'll be going to Auburn, you'll be going to Mississippi State, but you get to host Tennessee. Now your away games are LSU, Oklahoma, and Vandy, and you get to have Georgia, Missouri, and South Carolina come to your stadium. So, like I said, it's still like a really good schedule. I think it's not going to be um, too battle tested, but there's still like some interesting, like going to Auburn, even if Auburn's not as good, it's still going to be a hard fought game. Going to LSU, going to Oklahoma. So I really like that kind of schedule for Alabama. I think, like I said, it's challenging enough, but it's not too strenuous. So that ends Alabama. Let's go to Arkansas. Now, Arkansas, um, obviously a little bit out west, but I want to focus on especially like some of the big rivalries and also kind of renew another one. So, huge rivalry in LSU. Got to keep the Golden Boot. They absolutely hate each other. So LSU, Texas A&M, that's a big one too, especially with Texas A&M coming into the SEC. And really, the last couple of years, it's gotten really, really big. Where like even they play in Jerry World, like I said, a big time thing. And also Texas coming back to not coming back, but Texas coming into the SEC. Texas and Arkansas hate each other, so seeing them become like even more rivals as well, it's going to be huge for the SEC to continue on having these good marquee matchups as long as Arkansas kind of hopefully trends in the right direction. So based upon the 2026, they'll be at LSU, they'll be at Texas, and they'll be home against Texas A&M, even though technically it's Jerry World. But you'll be able to play at Kentucky, at South Carolina, and like I said, so there's your thing right there. You don't have to do that many road games, even though they're going to be strenuous road games. So obviously LSU and Texas are huge, but Kentucky, South Carolina is kind of hard. But it's like I said, you get most of your home games. One thing I also want to note, I think I've already said, I don't remember if I said it before, is every single season, so whether it be the 2026 or 2027, you'll have either more road games or more away games. I'm not going to do like, basically if 2026 you have 4 away games, that means in 2027 you're going to have 5. Just to make sure there's a little bit of a balance where you're not, having way more home games than everybody else in the league. That way we can have a little more fairness. Um, the home games for Arkansas, you have Vandy, Oklahoma, Alabama, and also Georgia. Like I said, it's still a tough schedule, but you have a lot of good home matchups. That's going to be good for your boosters, be good for your fans, and I think it's going to be manageable enough. Obviously, hopefully, if Arkansas continues to trend up in the right direction. And 2027, like I said, those constant opponents they flip, so you'll get to host LSU, get to host Texas, and have to go to Texas A&M. Like I said, same thing for Jerry World, but you'll be going to Mississippi State, to Florida, to Missouri, to Auburn, but you do get to host Ole Miss and Tennessee. Like I said, that's a good home slate. You get to host Ole Miss, Tennessee, LSU, and Texas. Like I said, I think that even though Arkansas is kind of a tough schedule, but you get really good home games as well. That hopefully that home crowd, Woo Pig Suey, everything like that kind of keeps you in the game. And Arkansas is always wild. I love watching Arkansas games. Sometimes I don't like playing against them because it always turns out to like a really, really weird game. But I love your team, and I think this would be a great catalyst for you to be able to compete against teams of the West for your recruiting battles. And it's not going to be too strenuous for you. Now moving on to Auburn. So obviously, you got to have the Iron Bowl against Alabama, and you got to have Deep South's oldest rivalries. You got to have with Georgia. Now, for the third one, there could be a lot. There could be a couple different. I decided to keep the LSU one. Now, obviously, LSU fans or even Alabama fans, I understand if you're like, well, you're an Auburn fan, you decided to keep LSU. Yes, I did. A little bit on me, but I think that it's a storied. It's a very storied rivalry. Obviously the Tire Bowl. Obviously, like there has been so many times where in the past that it's been a big proponent of who's gonna make it to the SEC. That has been in quite some time, but always very good game. And so I decided to keep it there. We can always make tweaks. You can say something in the comments below. But based upon that, constant opponents. In 2026, we would be at Alabama, we'd be at Georgia, but we do get to host at LSU. That would be the away games that we would have to go to, though, in lieu of also the Alabama and Georgia, is Texas, at Ole Miss, at Mississippi State. So the Texas, Alabama, and Georgia are very daunting away games, but you do get a good slate of home games, not to mention getting LSU at home, but you also get to have South Carolina at home, Tennessee at home, Florida at home. Those are four really good home matchups that you get to kind of like, okay, well, it's a tough schedule, but you have four good home games and you have three pretty tough away games. So I think it's still kind of a daunting SEC schedule, but I think that you'll be able to work it out as far as like hopefully having a decent year. I am praying that we have a decent year this year. Going into 2027, like I said, those constant opponents would just flip. So you, like I said, you have at LSU, you get to host Bama and Georgia. You have to go to Kentucky, have to go to Texas A&M, have to go to Missouri, but then you get to host Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Vanderbilt. Now, obviously, 2027 is based upon what's happening in 2025, so it's kind of going off of that schedule. So not as daunting as what 2026 would be, but I think all the same, it would be interesting to have to go to LSU, go to Texas A&M, and even Missouri has caused some trouble in the last couple of years. So going on to Florida. Now, Florida, common opponents, obviously, I think this one's kind of chalk. You got to do Tennessee, you got to do Georgia, and you got to do Kentucky. Now, I know Kentucky technically, like, you had that long streak, was it 31 straight wins or something like that? And then Kentucky got you back to back. And then it's been kind of Florida ever since. But it's still a big rivalry as well. It also is not too daunting because, like I said, if Tennessee continues to be on the path of being 9, 10 win seasons constantly, them and Georgia, I think it's good for Florida because you're already going to have, your hands full with hopefully if Florida State can get back to their, you know, kind of relevance, but you never know. So with their constant opponents, like I said, based upon what happened last year, you'll go to Kentucky. You'll get to host Tennessee, and then obviously the largest cocktail party in the world. That's going to be in Jacksonville. So that's not really, it's kind of home and away, but it's basically, split down the middle. But Florida, you will be going to South Carolina, be going to Alabama, to Missouri, and to Auburn. And you do get to host Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. So like I said, in some years you'll have more away games than you have home games. But going into 2027, you will not only do you get to host Kentucky, obviously you got to go to Tennessee, you have Georgia, but you get to host LSU, you get to host Texas A&M, you get to host Ole Miss, and you get to host Arkansas. Now you do have to go to Texas and go to Mississippi State, but your only really hard away games are Tennessee and Texas. The rest are going to be either home games or you should be able to beat that team. So I think 2027 will be a great year for Florida. Obviously, that's depending on how that team's looking by 2027. But it's another thing throughout the season that I'm breaking down for each team. There are going to be some years it's going to be really, really hard for you, but other seasons are going to be actually, somewhat decent where, okay, well, if we have a good enough team, we can make it to the SEC championship game. Moving on to Georgia. Now, obviously, like I said, the constant opponents are kind of, but not, they're two of them are kind of chalk. What I was talking about before, that's Auburn and Florida. You got to keep those games. The third one was kind of hard to decide on. I kind of had to decide between Tennessee and South Carolina. Because of the fact of other rivalries, I decided to stay with Georgia versus South Carolina. I know some people are going to be like, you have to keep the Georgia Tennessee. I just feel like, especially with a lot of the talent that's been in both South Carolina and Georgia, where both of them have been very, very against each other, try to make sure they get the most talent. And also, really, as of recently, with South Carolina getting back into hopefully some winning ways, I think it'll be very interesting to see if that rivalry can continue to bloom as it did really in the 2010s. It was especially the early 2010s was a very, very back and forth. Whoever would win pretty much the SEC East. So That would be the constant opponents, which would mean in 2026 they would host Auburn, but they would have to go to Florida, which technically, like I said, it's the Jacksonville State, it's the Jacksonville, Florida, and then they have to go to South Carolina. Now their away games for 2026 would be at Arkansas, at Missouri, and at Vanderbilt. So very easily you could have a pretty decent season with this because you have to host LSU, host Texas A&M, and host Oklahoma. So it really not that bad of a schedule. Like most of your, you know, harder opponents are going to be home games, and then you have to go obviously to South Carolina, which is going to be a little bit of a trap game, and then at Arkansas. Arkansas is always, you also have to be kind of careful with them. In 2027, like I said, that rotation of the constant opponents. So you have to go to Auburn. You have to go. You have to basically the Jacksonville now is technically Florida's in their home, and then you get to host South Carolina. But you have to go to Ole Miss, to Alabama, and to Kentucky. But you do get to host Tennessee, Texas, and Mississippi State. So I think, like I said, it's a little bit of a harder schedule, but at the same exact time, I think that you'll be able to. Georgia's going to be Georgia. Georgia's going to be good. So more likely to be knocking on the door to try to make the SEC championship game. They are, unfortunately, as an Auburn fan, seeing Georgia become actually consistent is unbearable. Going off of Georgia and going on to Kentucky, we'll talk about the three constant opponents. Now, I already talked about before with Florida. You keep that Florida Kentucky. I think you keep the Kentucky and Vanderbilt game. I think that's a still a pretty really even rivalry. I think it's like 48-44 if I remember correctly. It's pretty close. And then I decided, like I said, South Carolina coming into the SEC East for so long. You have some rivalries a little bit with them, but it's not like really any strong rivalry. So in the later video, I want to talk about with Clemson potentially coming in, that could help out South Carolina because right now South Carolina doesn't have a lot of, you know, major rivalries in the SEC. But Kentucky, those are your three constant opponents. So in 2026, like I said, you'll be hosting Vanderbilt. You get to go to Vanderbilt, hosting South Carolina, hosting Florida. But your 2026 opponents, it's gonna be a little bit hard, but you gotta go to Alabama, got to go to Texas A&M, and then obviously you got to go to Mississippi State. But you do get to host Texas A&M, Arkansas, and also Oklahoma. So it's like I said, it's a tough schedule, but you have some really good home games. Like I said, you got Oklahoma, who's probably going to be pretty good by next year. Texas A&M, South Carolina, Florida. Like I said, that's a really good slate of home games for your fans. Going into 2027, like I said, those constant opponents they flip. So you go to Florida, go to South Carolina, but you do get to host Vandy. A little bit of a harder schedule. You do have to go to Ole Miss again and to Tennessee. So, like I said, some kind of hard away games, but again, you get to host Georgia, you get to host Texas, you get to host Missouri, and get to host Auburn. So another good slate of home games for your team. Obviously, Kentucky the last couple of years haven't been very good, but at the same exact time, you never know. Like every now and then, Kentucky would have close to a 10-win season, or they can start the season pretty hot, be like 6-0, and then kind of bottom out at the end of the year. You never really know with Kentucky. I can't really say much. I'm an Auburn fan, so moving on to LSU. Now, obviously, I've gone mentioned before with the constant opponents and how that's kind of changed. I've already said Auburn. I've already said Arkansas. But one more I want to make sure that you keep in there, and that's going to be the Magnolia Bowl, and that's going to be against Ole Miss. That's a huge one. Now, I decided to keep that one. I decided to keep the Golden Boot. If you want to switch out Auburn for Alabama for LSU fans, if you want to comment make comments in the comment below, I totally understand. That was just on my call. But in that case, for the constant opponents, that would just mean that you would get to host Arkansas, you get to host Ole Miss, and you have to go to Auburn. Now, your away games are kind of tough. Now, Auburn hopefully will be good, but you have to go to Texas, you have to go to Georgia, and you go to Missouri, which Missouri is always kind of an interesting bunch, especially the last couple of years. But You get to host Tennessee, you get to host Kentucky, host Mississippi State. So really only two really good teams are coming to your house, so it's a little bit of a difficult schedule, but I don't think it's unbearable depending on how things kind of line up. In 2027 though is going to be an interesting year for you because of the fact that you get to host Auburn, but you have to go to Ole Miss, to Arkansas, and you have to go to Texas A&M, to Florida, to South Carolina. But you get to host Alabama, Oklahoma, and Vanderbilt. So, like I said, it's a decent enough schedule. Um, I think that you can definitely be able to win 9 games with both of these schedules, and to be knocking on the door to make the SEC championship game because it's going to be a very very interesting couple of years of like how many teams are like basically like pining to try to get to the SEC because there's going to be a lot of good teams, especially if we expand, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Um, Going on to Missouri. So Missouri, unfortunately for Missouri, there's not a lot of rivalries that you can really kind of depend on. Like there's only really one, and that's with South Carolina. That's with the majors, the Mayor's Cup, because they're both Columbia. Like I said, Missouri was the hardest one for me to do. So their three constant opponents are going to be Oklahoma, so connection to the to the old Big 12, old Big 8. South Carolina, like I said, because of the Mayor Bowl, and then honestly, I was like, you know what? I was like, the battle of the Miss. So you got Missouri versus Mississippi State. I Mississippi State was a little bit harder too, but even if it's not technically a rivalry that's being protected, it's just like I think there'll be an interesting fan experience for both teams because they're both a little. I want to say on the outside looking in the same kind of way, but it feels kind of I'm being like disrespectful. I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's very hard for me to find rivalries for y'all. Sorry, but Missouri with those constant opponents, you would be in 2026. You'd be hosting South Carolina, be hosting Mississippi State, and then going to Oklahoma. Now, the only thing is that your away games for 2026 would be at Texas, at Tennessee, at Ole Miss. So a little bit rough, but you do get to host Georgia, LSU, and Florida. So like I said, it's a kind of tough schedule, but the fact that you have three kind of hard away games. Well, I would say probably four kind of hard away games, but you do get a pretty good slate at home as well, so that'd be good for your fans. And then 2027, like I said, rules are reversed. You get to host South Carolina, get to host Mississippi State. Have to go to Oklahoma though, and then you have to go to Alabama, go to Texas A&M, and then you have to go to Kentucky. So, like I said, a little bit of a hard road schedule. I think it's a little bit easier than it was last year, but you do get to host Auburn, Vandy, and Arkansas, and with South Carolina and Mississippi State. So I think it's a good home schedule for you as well, where it's bearable enough that I think maybe Missouri, like with Eli Drinkwitz, where they have the last 2 years. Obviously, a lot of the talent has left. If they're able to have consistent success, I think there's a chance that Missouri can make the SEC championship game. Now, will they win it? Probably not. But I think that Missouri's in an interesting spot because they are very. And I wanted to be a little bit tangent, but they're improving vastly, but a lot of that talent's gone. If Eli's able to replace that, then the sky's the limit for Missouri because Missouri's in an interesting spot where they're kind of still technically in the Midwest ish, but they're in the SEC and they're in a recruiting battle for pretty much every single talent because their proximity to a lot of the SEC powerhouses. So I'm interested to see what Missouri does this year. I'm rooting for them. Obviously, never want to go against Auburn, but you know. Now, actually, moving on to Mississippi State. Sorry for that tangent. Moving on to Mississippi State. So, their constant opponents. Obviously, you got to keep the Egg Bowl. Ole Miss, Alabama, I've already mentioned, and then Missouri was the other one that was kind of filling in a constant opponent. So that just be you have to go to Alabama, go to Ole Miss, kind of rough. You get to host Missouri, and then you have to go to LSU, to Oklahoma, and to Vandy. So, like I said, a little bit of a road schedule, but you do get to host Auburn, you get to host South Carolina, and you get to host Kentucky. So, like I said, Mississippi State's another one of those interesting teams. I don't really know how Levy's going to do. Hopefully, he does really well with Mississippi State. Hopefully, they're back to making bowl games. Every now and then have a pretty decent season where you're like, oh, look at there. But it hasn't been good the last couple of years for Mississippi State. In 2027, like I said, those roles reverse the constant opponents. So you get to host Alabama, you get to host Ole Miss, and then you got to go to Mizzou. But your away games, you have at Texas, at Tennessee, at Georgia. Very sorry about that, but at least you get to host Alabama and Ole Miss. And speaking of hosting, you get to host Arkansas, Texas A&M, and Florida. So, like I said, it's going to be a tough slate for Mississippi State, but I think at the end of the day, you have some pretty interesting games you get to have at home. Hopefully, you have like a couple of upsets in there. And, maybe you can get back to bowl relevance in the next couple of years. I'm kind of hoping that you do, because I do like when Mississippi State's pretty good. Do you ever want to go to the stadium? No, because I don't want to hear the cowbell. If you're wondering why it's taking me a little bit while to read, this is what my page looks like. And I have three of them that looks just like this. So I'm like peering at it. Sorry about that. Moving on to Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, like I said, I'm gonna kind of like roll through these. Yeah, your constant opponents, obviously I mentioned before, Missouri, and then also it's gonna be Texas and Texas A&M. I mean, you have very much storied history against each other, especially with the Big Ten, and many years since then. Y'all are around the same exact region as two, so you need to have the constant opponents. And like I said, I'll have it on the screen of like the schedule to kind of roll through because it's kind of taking a little bit of time. But like I said, I think that 2026 is a winnable year. You have some interesting road games like Georgia and Florida, but for the most part, it's kind of manageable. And then you go in 2027, it's kind of a rough test. Like I said, you got at Texas A&M, at Auburn, at LSU, at Ole Miss, and to go against Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina. So very sorry about that, Oklahoma. But 2026 looks good. But 2027 is a little bit rough. Now moving on to Ole Miss. Now Ole Miss, their constant opponents, obviously have to keep the Egg Bowl, Mississippi State, have to do the Magnolia Bowl with LSU, and then the third one, where technically you could have swapped it out for Alabama if you want to keep Alabama and Ole Miss together, but I decided to get Ole Miss and Vanderbilt. So technically a rivalry. And I was like, well, this still keeps Vanderbilt with a kind of hard opponent with another hard opponent we'll talk about a little bit later. And I think that Ole Miss and Vanderbilt, like I said, just playing each other a lot. Who knows? Vanderbilt could upset them because they're hopefully on the up and up. Just some things we've kind of seen with their 2026 schedule. Obviously, they have to go to LSU, have to go to Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Texas. Kind of a hard one. And even their home game is a little bit harder because they have to go against Alabama and hopefully if Auburn's good. So a little bit tough, but like I said, I think it's manageable for Ole Miss. And then 2027, you have those roles reversed, and also the fact that you have to go to Arkansas, to South Carolina, to Florida. You do get host Georgia, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, but a little bit of a harder schedule. Now moving on to South Carolina, and like I said before, it's kind of hard for me to find a lot of rivalries that I want to keep with you, but I do want to keep the Georgia one because I think it's an important one. The Missouri is more of just like a Mayor Cup, and then Kentucky. Um, Honestly, it's like because I think that it's a generally around that region of like before you get up to North Carolina and also up into Virginia. South Carolina, Kentucky does do some recruiting in there, and so it's a little bit of a recruiting battle. Um, like I said, in 2026, I think it's a reasonable schedule for South Carolina because honestly, you have to go to Auburn, to Tennessee, and to Mississippi State, but you get to host Texas and Florida and Arkansas and Georgia. So, like I said, you have a lot of good home games for South Carolina, and that South Carolina stadium is going to be rocking when those teams come to town. In 2027, like I said, the rules reverse for the constant opponents, but your away schedule is a little bit daunting because you have to go to Bama, to Georgia, to Oklahoma. Kind of rough away schedule, but you do get to host LSU, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M. So, like I said, still really good home games for your rambunctious crowd. Now moving on to Tennessee. Now Tennessee, like I said before, you got to have that Alabama, you got to have that Vandy, and you got to have that Florida. I think those are really good uh, rivalries that I want to keep. And like I said, that Georgia. I mean, if you want to cut out Vandy, you could do that instead of Georgia. But I think that keeping that Vandy, keeping that in-state rivalry, even though Tennessee dominates it, it's still important to have. Um, in 2026, like I said, you kind of have a hard schedule. You have to go to Florida, to Auburn, to LSU, and to Texas A&M. But you do get to host Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss. So like some tough games, but you do have some pretty good home games. In 2027, those roles reverse for the common opponents. A little bit rough because you have to go to Alabama and to Georgia, but at the same time, you get to host Texas, you get to host Florida. You have some pretty good home games as well. Moving on to Texas. Now, Texas, obviously, their 2025 schedule is a little bit of I want to say cakewalk, but SEC wise, they only have a couple of hard teams. So in 2026, I should talk about the constant opponent. It's all going to be out west: Arkansas, Oklahoma, and then Texas A&M. Kind of self-explanatory. But in 2026, not only do you have to go to Texas A&M, but you have to go to Alabama, you have to go to South Carolina. So they said kind of an interesting road schedule. We have to go against pretty tough opponents. But to be fair, Texas, you do get to host Auburn, LSU, and Ole Miss. So, and also Arkansas. So like I said, you have a little bit of a tough schedule, but it's not going to be like where like Texas fans are going to be absolutely complaining. In 2027, the roles reverse. You have to go to Arkansas, but you do get to host Texas A&M, and you get to host Florida. But you got to go to Tennessee. You got to go to Georgia. Like I said, the other ones are kind of easy. The way they kind of like has played out, where Texas, their schedule this upcoming year I got to add Tennessee into that 2027, but it's kind of an easier road. It's kind of an easier schedule. But I mentioned there where like they have to go to these hard teams, while also having some decent home games as well. Moving on to Texas A&M, it's constant opponents: Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. So pretty much same as I think with Texas. You're going to have a pretty interesting slate of home games because you get to host Alabama, you get to host Tennessee, you get to host Ole Miss, you get to host Texas. Like I said, in 2026, you have some pretty good home games, while also mixing in some pretty tough away games where you have to go to Georgia, you got to go to Arkansas, go to Oklahoma, and obviously go to Vandy and Kentucky. But that's you should, as Texas A&M, be able to handle that. In 2027, so you'll have to go to Texas. But as far as your other away games, it's not like too much. Like I said, you have to go to Florida and to South Carolina. So it's three tough road games. But you get to host Arkansas, get to host Oklahoma, host Missouri, host LSU, host Auburn. Like I said, in 2027, that's a pretty good schedule where you have a lot of pretty good home games. And then finally up is going to be Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt, like I said, your three common opponents are going to be Tennessee. Got to have the in-state rivalry. Kentucky versus Vanderbilt is a very, very back and forth rivalry. I think, like I said before, about 48-44. And then Ole Miss, like I said, technically is a rivalry. I did not know it was. I like I said, it's kind of just filling in somebody because I don't think like you want to have another hard opponent for Vanderbilt to have as a constant opponent. In 2026, like I said, you have a pretty interesting schedule where obviously you have to go to Ole Miss, you have to go to Arkansas, to Florida, to Oklahoma. But you get to host Georgia, Texas A&M, Tennessee, and then your rivalry Kentucky. So pretty decent schedule. And then 2027, like I said, those roles reverse. You get to host Ole Miss, you get to host Alabama, you get to host Texas, you get to host South Carolina. But you have to go to LSU, Auburn, Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So a little bit of a tough schedule. Now, as I mentioned before, at the very end of the schedule, I want to reveal why it took me a little bit long time to make this video because I had an epiphany. Well, if Clemson and Florida State announced that they're going to join the SEC, I don't want the video to look bad by within a year. So I included a way for the schedule of a 9 game schedule to be able to work if Clemson and Florida State come into the league. Now, if there's more people that come into the league, like say like a Duke or North Carolina joins the league because SEC wants more basketball, then it's going to kind of suck and this is going to be awful. But for the time being, I have broke down into 3 different divisions where it's not really divisions. It's mainly of like how the scheduling takes place. It carries up with, you know, rivalries, storied rivalries to make sure that you keep them in the SEC while also allowing you to do what we did in years previously, where in each division you had a constant opponent and then you had a rotating opponent. So, in those same kind of veins, be able to work it into this new SEC if we go to 18 teams and gain Clemson and Florida State. So, how would that work? Well, like I said, you have 3 divisions. One division would be the West. So there'd be most of the teams that came in from the Big 12. That would be your Texas, your Oklahoma, your Texas A&M, and your Missouri, while also adding Arkansas and LSU. So those are your group of 6. So your first group of 6 is the West. Then comes Central. So that Central is going to be Auburn, Alabama. It's going to be your Tennessee teams. It's going to be Vandy and Tennessee. And it's going to be your Mississippi teams with Mississippi State and Ole Miss. So keeping a lot of those rivalries together. And then, as I'll mention a little bit later, you have one common opponent from each of the other division. So we talk about West, we talk about Central, let's talk about the last one. That is going to be the East. So the East is going to have your Florida and your Florida State. So very storied programs. Then you have your Clemson and your South Carolina. Like I said, got to have that rivalry together. And then it has to be Georgia for the main rivalries together, and then Kentucky kind of carries on up into the rear. So basically, you have West, Central, and also East to make up 3 divisions of how scheduling would work. Now, I'll put on the screen without going into super duper detail. I kind of do like a little brief overview, so this video is not too long, but you keep a lot of these storied rivalries, as you can see on the screen, for each team, but you also add in some constant opponents where I think, as far as SEC wise, what would be a good matchup? What would be good TV? So, like, obviously, you have Auburn, Georgia is a very storied rivalry, but then you have Auburn and Arkansas. It is always an entertaining game, whether it be a blowout, whether it be 5 overtimes, whether it be a slog fest where technically we probably should have lost because Bo Nix threw it behind his back. Sorry, Arkansas, for bringing up a bad memory, but that was an entertaining game. It's one of those things where it's always an entertaining game. SEC probably would look at that and be like, hey, Auburn has a constant West team, and that's going to be Arkansas. And I did not even do LSU like I did in the previous one. I kind of let that one go. Now for Alabama, where Alabama with the West and the East, I could have done Alabama LSU, but I decided to do something different because in my mind, Alabama, very short program. SEC is going to want to have them go against some top teams. So for their 2 constant opponents, they got to go against Texas and Clemson. Now, obviously, some Alabama fans be like, that's not fair. And I'm like, well, you're a premier team. SEC is going to make sure that they have some premier games. And if you're playing Texas and you're playing Clemson every single year, that's going to be 2 of the biggest games every single year. So those are your other constant opponents in the 18-game schedule. Tennessee, you got to have the Florida one, but also with Josh Heupel being at Tennessee, especially if there's a chance that he goes to Oklahoma. I'm not going to try to jinx you, but that's a possibility. The Tennessee versus Oklahoma could be a very storied rivalry as well, because just so it would have the same Bowl with LSU and Alabama, It could be the same as that way for Oklahoma and Tennessee. Ole Miss, like I said, you got to have the LSU Ole Miss. You got to have the Magnolia Bowl. But I think Ole Miss versus Florida State would be a very interesting matchup, especially Lane Kiffin versus Mike Norvell. If Mike Norvell is still there by the time that Florida State joins the SEC, very interesting coaches, and I think that they would definitely get under each other's skin. So I think it's gonna be an interesting matchup as far as like different play styles, but just like the different vibes of Florida State and Ole Miss, Mississippi State. I just did the maroon teams. I'm gonna be honest with you. I did South Carolina and I did Texas A&M. I just did the maroon teams. Mississippi, like I said, Mississippi State's kind of hard to find who I want to have constant opponents. But like I said, you get the what I mean. Technically, South Carolina, I don't think is. I think it's technically Garnet, but it's close enough. Close enough. Um, Vandy, like I said, you got Vandy, Kentucky, and then you got Vandy, Missouri. Same exact thing we talked about before. Kind of hard to find Missouri rivalry. Kind of hard to find Vandy a long-term rivalry. So kind of just stick those two together. Texas, like I said before, you got to go against Alabama, but you also have to go against Georgia. Yes, very entertaining game this past season. I'm sure SEC will look at it and be like, Texas at uh, Texas at Georgia this upcoming year. If this goes down as what it was has this past two times they played against each other, SEC is going to look at that big money and be like, we want to make sure that's a storied rivalry that starts to happen as Texas join into the league. Um, Texas A&M, already talked about them in Mississippi State, and then Texas A&M plays Florida State. The many times that Jimbo Fisher has beaten down Texas A&M as their head coach has left a little bad taste in their mouth for Florida State, allowing him to join them. And I just think, like I said, it'd be a good fun, like I said, with Florida State playing not only Ole Miss but also playing Texas A&M. And then Arkansas, I already said about Auburn. I kind of just added Kentucky. I think out of the East teams that were available, like I said, it's not really like a story rivalry, but it's one of the things that I think that could be interesting with Mark Stoops if he's still there. LSU are talking about with them and Ole Miss, but them LSU in Florida. That's a really that crazy rivalry. Always a good game as well. Should be an interesting game this upcoming year as well. And then Missouri, I already talked about that. Vandy, South Carolina. Like I said, Missouri still has that rivalry technically with South Carolina since Missouri joined in. And Oklahoma, you got Tennessee, but you also get Clemson. I like the fact of Oklahoma going against Clemson with Brent Venables being in Oklahoma, being the long-term defense coordinator for Clemson. A lot of story rivalry between a lot of stories lines between the two. That could be a very fun matchup. Now, as I mentioned before, I already kind of list of the constant opponents and also the divisions. But how are we able to make sure that we play every single team? So, in a rotation of every 5 years, you will play one other team from each division. So, say you're from the Central, you'll play one other team from the East and one other team from the West. So, in this hypothetical 2026, 2027, 2028, whenever this would ever be, it would be where each of these three groups would play each other, and then you would switch. So basically, you just move to another team that you play. And in this case, Auburn would play Florida State and Mizzou, bring it back to 2013. But I think that's a good matchup where Florida State would also play against Mizzou. So what could have been if Missouri had beaten Auburn in the SC championship game? Um, like I said, I think that's a good pairing. Alabama, you're playing LSU, but you're also playing Kentucky because, like back in the day, Alabama Kentucky used to be a little bit rivalry. That was one of the ones where, like you're playing opposite division. Now technically that would be Tennessee that Alabama was playing, but it was also a fun little nod to where Bear Bryant got his start in Kentucky. I think he got a start in Texas A&M, then Kentucky, then technically Alabama. The third grouping is going to be Ole Miss with South Carolina and Texas. I think that's a really good pairing as well. I think it's sort of like fun matchups, fun storylines as well. Um, Moving on, Mississippi State. I think it's a good matchup with Arkansas and Clemson. Now, Clemson, like I said, is still going to be a really good team, regardless of how your feelings are about Dabo Swinney. And Arkansas versus Clemson could be a very fun matchup. Mississippi State's always interesting as well. Like I said, hopefully they get back to being good. Um, who knows with Jeff Lebby? And the fifth pairing, Tennessee, you get that with Georgia, and you get it with Texas A&M as well. I think that's a really interesting slate of games. Texas A&M, Georgia would be interesting as well as Texas A&M and Tennessee. And then the last pairing is going to be Vandy with Florida and also Oklahoma. So obviously, like I said, these would be just like in a rotation. Or the next year, you would basically go against a different SEC East team and a different SEC West team. But that would be the basis of how I could see potentially if we were to expand into 18 teams, how we can make that work. Now, the reason why it took me so long to make this video was because I was trying to wrap my head around, well, if Duke and North Carolina join and we become 20 teams, how could I make that work? And I was going through all different kind of stuff of making 4 kind of divisions with 5 things to try to keep all the story rivalries together, and that was kind of hard. Or I was making a very weaker division where I was like, that would be kind of, a lot of teams would be like, why do I have this so hard division? And then, Clemson has, basically not good football teams with Duke and North Carolina. Like, it's like that kind of stuff. Like, it's like, like trying to keep a lot of the story rivalries together as the conference continues to expand is going to be harder and harder. I believe there's a way that we can do it, but it would also mean that we wouldn't be able to play each other as consistently. Sorry, and that's my main goal. I want to make sure that every single team has opportunity at least once in their playing career to play against another team. Now, obviously, in the 18 game, it would be a 5-year rotation, but at the same time, you would absolutely be able to play each other and have a lot of fun matchups. Let me know what you thought think in the comments below. The last schedule video that I made of the 18 game schedule for the NFL, that one did pretty well. I'm hoping this one does pretty well as well. Like I said, I am going to do a little bit more of SEC videos this upcoming year. So if you like this one, be prepared for more. And also talking a lot more about Auburn football. And hopefully we are getting back to being a good team. I mentioned that several times before because it is depressing being an Auburn fan these last couple of years, especially being there on campus as a student. So thank you so much for watching. As always, comment what you think down in the comments below. Love to hear from the fans. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.